the moment, in the Methods Lab, we're trying to run a series of conversations. Some of you were present when Kevin and Malik offered us their thoughts, which utilised our own interdisciplinary resources and traditions on the creative and critical ways of forging social intervention beyond the noose of policy directives on what ought to constitute social impact. So we've specifically asked John Scott to deliver this year's Methods Lab because of the way in which he's currently evacuating the deployment of social surveys alongside film documentaries and dramas, and would you believe it, in early British sociology. Much of what took place in this building in Chelsea is going to give us a sense of that. John Scott, just to give you some background, has developed his work on sociological methods in tandem with his theorizations of global power, elites, classes and corporations. His research directions have been used and deployed all over the world. His publications are many, and here are a few, just a few. He developed his revealing analysis of corporate power through the innovation of network analysis. I have to remind you that he started this well before we had the ease of email, software, and the mouse, click of a mouse. He used punched cards to feed into computer terminals. And in every university that I go to work in, I'm often reminded of the time when we think it's in 91, at his inaugural at the University of Lecture, where I first worked with him. During the course of his analysis of transnational classes and corporations, in his characteristic, unassuming way, he quietly turned his attention to a diagram he had developed which observed the networks and cliques that existed within the University of Leicester itself. So I often think wherever I'm sitting now, you could quietly do that and probably disturb a few people. But I haven't done it. So reflecting on finding sociology as a student and his life as a sociologist, he's remarked, in all that I've done over the years, I've tried to recapture something of the excitement of my student days. The years when I began to enjoy academic study, discovered sociology and decided that that was the direction I wanted to follow. So today we look forward to hearing what he is currently discovering of sociology, the surveys, drama and the renewal of life, labour and thought within this building.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. It was interesting seeing the punch cards and remembering back to that. When I was doing the analysis of directorships using these punch cards, every time that I ran the programme, it used, I think, 25% of the University of Leicester's budget on the Manchester supercomputer. And one hole in the wrong place meant that it had to be redone, and it made the physicist very cross that a mere sociologist was actually using the computer. Well, I want to talk about a group of people who were pioneers in a time well before computers, but who actually developed, I think, a lot of ideas that are coming back today. A particular intellectual circle of people that were really very central to British sociology, and who are largely unknown today. The key members of this intellectual circle were Patrick Geddes and Victor Branford. Geddes is known a little bit, particularly amongst planners and geographers. Branford, virtually unknown. But these are the people who floated the Sociological Society in Britain in 1903. They set up, a few years later, the Sociological Review as the first professional journal. And actually I think the Sociological Society was the first professional sociological organisation in the world. They brought together in that sociological society a very diverse group of people who were interested in sociology. At that time, obviously, it was not established as a university discipline, and so the people who came together were philosophers, there were evolutionists, social reformers, a lot of clergymen in the society, and those who Philip Abrahams in his history described as very old men. The society dominated by these old men at the time. Within the society, they took this deliberately very ecumenical approach, trying to bring together a whole variety of different styles and strategies of research. They had their own particular image of what sociology should be like, but they wanted to establish this broad church basis. That in some ways was the source of problems that they had. The society was, from its early days, highly factional. Within a few years, the eugenists split off, those who were into eugenics, and set up their own organisation, developing a more demographic and biological approach. And for much of the history of the society, there was a huge tension between the evolutionists, led by Hobhouse, and Geddes and his group, who took a rather different environmental approach to sociology. The evolutionists were pretty much focused at the LSE, where they'd been established, and became dominant in the profession as it expanded during the interwar years. The kind of dissociation of them from the society because of its dominance by Geddes and Branford underpinned the long-term decline of the society. The society eventually disappeared in the 1930s, and the LSE group of sociologists, particularly led by Ginsberg and T.H. Marshall, went on eventually to form the British Sociological Association and the British Journal of Sociology in the post-war period. And I think that kind of institutional history and struggle underpins the loss from memory of Geddes, Branford and their associates, because they were sidelined from the mainstream, which moved in this evolutionary direction and became the core mainstream of British sociology. But I think that despite that fact that they were bypassed and forgotten, they do have still a lot of very important things to tell us, a lot of ideas that are really only now being rediscovered and reaffirmed, often without any kind of conception that they date back to these early British sociologists. One of their main concerns, for example, was the environment, environmental issues. They took an approach that focused on the constraining effects of the physical environment on social life, and particularly the urban environment, and related that to the cultural shaping, the aesthetic shaping of the environment as a created environment. And so they were looking at both sides of this process, the constraining role of the environment and the shaping of the environment. And they were linked with that, taking environmentalism in a much broader way in pioneering ecological and green issues. They were involved in the early development of the green movement. So a lot of concerns there that I think are, again, central today, but we don't associate it with the origins of British sociology. Another area where they were really pioneering was in work on globalization and cosmopolitanism. They were very committed to the idea that we need to take a global perspective, and it was Geddes in his work in 1912 who invented the idea of think global and act local. I haven't been able to pin down the actual phrase, but it's certainly the idea of understanding things in their global context and focusing your actions on the local was central to what they were concerned with. and they were developing ideas about the need for a more cosmopolitan perspective to break with national boundaries and establish a more universal cosmopolitan standpoint. The other area, and the one I'm going to concentrate on today, was their role in relation to research methods, the kind of contributions that they made there, where alongside fairly conventional approaches, they introduced new ways of both collecting and presenting sociological information that I think we can learn a lot from, particularly in terms of the current debate on impact. I'm not sure that what I'm talking about will enable us to maximise impact, however we mean it in the research assessments, but certainly they were introducing alternative and quite innovative ways of achieving impact, and I think we can learn from that. Well, I'll say a little bit about who Geddes and Branford were, since they are relatively unknown. Geddes was born in 1854 in Scotland and was largely self-educated. He was his main background was in biology and botany. This was his starting point. But he encountered the work of Le Play, the French social ethnographer, in the 1870s, and immediately found that Le Play's emphasis on the role of the environment was something that chimed with his own biological concerns, and wanted to move towards an idea of a social theory that would complement the biological theory of environmental forces and an ecological perspective. He largely followed a career in biology and botany. He not until late in life, and then in India rather than in Britain, did he get a chair in sociology. His boyhood friend Martin White did put up the money to finance a chair in sociology at the London School of Economics, in the hope that in this way Geddes would get the chair, but he made such a mess of the interview that the chair went to Hobhouse, and again that was a source of later conflict. The principal chair at the LSE is still the Martin White chair in sociology, and it's interesting to speculate how different the history of British sociology might have been if Geddes had been appointed instead of Hobhouse. Branford was born in 1863, a little bit later. He was someone who had a very difficult childhood. He had a very eccentric father, to say the least, eccentric, who was a veterinary professor who was appointed in Edinburgh, was sacked from his job for incompetence, was reinstated, but ended up his career eventually imprisoned for fraud in connection with a horse lottery and guano manufacturing in South Africa. So a very peculiar and interesting figure. But Branford spent much of his youth trying to avoid his father's debtors, and this caused him immense problems. But when he studied at Edinburgh University, he came under the spell of Geddes. And although Geddes was a rather disorganised person, he was clearly something of a charismatic speaker when he could be bothered. And he attracted around him a group of students who were really inspired to carry forward Geddes' ideas. Branford was the leading figure in this group. But Branford himself didn't follow an academic career, largely, I think, because of his the problems of his father. He had to find some money quickly, and he went into business as a chartered accountant, and fairly soon built up quite an extensive business career in the railways in Paraguay, the telephones and tramways in Cuba, and shuttled backwards and forwards between South America, New York and London, and tried to combine that with his role in the sociological society. And he had actually a kind of a view that sociology needed to contribute to social development as part of a wider process of social reconstruction. He and Geddes both took a Comtean view about the way in which sociology should contribute to social reconstruction, and tried as much as possible to utilize his economic and financial knowledge generated through his business activities in connection with his sociology, and undertaking surveys in connection with the railways and the economic development of South America. So really quite an interesting career and combination of those two elements. And he, together with his second wife, Sibella Gurney, were the main protagonists in promoting the Geddes project, promoting the ideas that Geddes developed. The focus of their activities were really, for a long period, the Playhouse, the one in the poster, in Belgrave Road in Pimlico, now part of a hotel. But this is where, through much of the early years of the 20th century, the Sociological Society was based, and they actually used the building as part of their sociological work, as a way of presenting the work. I've not been able to get inside to see if it's still there, but somewhere on the ground floor in there was the council room of the society. And Geddes and Branford were closely associated with the arts and crafts movement and craftsmen around there, and commissioned the production of a wall frieze in the council room that was supposed to show a sociological view of the relationships between town and country. So it's showing a skyscape scene of London, and an aerial view of rural, I think probably Scotland, giving Geddes' background. But to try and show the relationship between the different environments in a visual form, and to keep that within the Sociological Society. And I think that was fairly typical of their general approach to sociology. They weren't developing this the kind of Comtean positivism in its standard form. They were trying to innovate in different ways of presenting sociological ideas, and wanting to develop close relationship with the arts of all kinds, with poetry, literature, sculpture, and drama. All of these they thought should be part and parcel of the way in which you produce sociology and present your sociological works. But I want to look at two different aspects of the kind of methods that they employed, which I think are particularly important for our considerations today. I want to look at their principal methods of data collection, and then their methods of analysis. In terms of methods of collection, the social survey was their preferred method, but they had a very particular and distinctive idea of what the social survey should consist in. The social survey wasn't simply collecting information on a questionnaire and collating the results. It was a much wider thing, and involved very close contact between the researcher and the research. You had to have this interchange between the two. They stressed very much the idea of the region, understanding social life in the regional environmental context in which it developed, how that the physical features of the region constrained the environment, the way of life, and how the development of towns and cities and the social life of the cities in turn shaped the region. So they wanted their survey to be a regional survey, a survey that was focused on very specific localities, and to understand those in their larger context. And because they assumed that the purpose of sociology was to contribute to social change, to social reconstruction, they wanted to involve people themselves in that process of developing the knowledge. They didn't want to have any kind of gulf between the sociologist and the outside world. Geddes had already, in Edinburgh, pioneered not only social settlements where there was social work activities linked with academic work, but also summer schools that involved liaison with teachers and others in the locality to try and break down these boundaries, that the teaching and presentation of sociology shouldn't be simply within the university, but had to be in relation to the world outside. And their idea of the survey really came out of that as almost a kind of form of action research, that you shouldn't have this kind of gulf. Their vision of the survey was of something really very broad and all-encompassing. They held that you start out in a survey from things like the Ordnance Survey maps. The Ordnance Survey was providing the basis, the physical base for a social survey, and on the maps you could have additions from land use. You could then go on to collect material from the census and neighbourhood level data. They were very interested in the work of Charles Booth, who'd collected information on particular neighbourhoods and then mapped those out to show the distribution of poverty on maps. And really they wanted to try and have this kind of sort of morphological basis for the survey through this mapping and charting, and tried to devise all sorts of ways of indexing material so that it could be cross-referred and properly located to its physical position. And I think they would have been very staunch supporters of the recent use of geographical information systems, postcode mapping and so on, as ways of relating data to particular places. But from that base, they then felt that you could go on to use photographs, documents, letters and other sources to fill out the more qualitative features of the area that you were studying, and again index these, relate them to the place. And again, I think I find all sorts of parallels with recent trends on the web. There is the website of Geograph, which is an attempt to have for people to locate photographs of each kilometre grid square on the Ordnance Survey maps. And I think this again would have been a way that they, if the technology had been available, could have developed their idea of the survey, this holistic approach. And then the final element, obviously, they saw was the use of interviews and observational data as exploring the locality and relating that back to the base map and chart. Geddes himself acquired ownership of a building in Edinburgh called the Outlook Tower. I'm not sure whether it's still open. It was open until a few years ago under changed ownership, and it has a camera obscura in the top. It's in the Royal Mile near the castle. And Geddes acquired this because you could go up to the top of the Outlook Tower, and through the camera obscura you could see the city of Edinburgh. And he then had all the various exhibits in his museum and archive arranged on floors below that, so you moved from a view of the city to a view of the wider region of Scotland. As you went downstairs, you went down further and you saw where all the commodities and goods came in terms of the exchange internationally. So you were moving from the local to the global as you moved down through the steps of the Outlook Tower. And this was an attempt to give some kind of physical expression to the idea of the social survey. So they had this idea of the kind of the holistic social survey that gave this all-encompassing view of a place, and that maintained the sense of place as centrally important. And for that reason, they wanted the people who lived in the place to be active participants in the research. They wanted people to identify with the purposes of the research. They wanted the research to develop in ways that reflected the interest and concerns of the inhabitants of the area, so that their ideas would feed insights into the actual analysis of the data. That would ensure that any kind of prescriptions and proposals for change, they argued, would at least be reflective of the concerns of the people who were going to be affected by those changes. So there was going to be a dialogue and conversation built in to the process of the survey. So it was very much an attempt to embed the survey and sociology in the society that it was studying. The second methodological area that I want to look at is how they went on to present their results, the kind of the presentation of data. They did, of course, produce the conventional, or in their cases perhaps not so conventional, journal articles, all the normal forms of presentation, publishing in books. Their literary skills weren't that great, and their books are rather difficult to read, which is another reason why they're largely forgotten. But they invented new ways of presenting their ideas. They were something of pioneers in the use of what today is PowerPoint. They developed a collection of magic lantern slides that could be used in lectures, and so prepared lectures for local societies to use, and would supply copies of the magic lantern slides to take this through. But the particular method that I want to talk about, which I think is very innovative in their ideas, is dramatization. They wanted to, as I said earlier, break down the boundaries between the arts and the sciences. And they recognized that literary forms of presentation, in particular drama, were important ways of getting the message across to lay people. That you needed to get beyond your scientific audience to the lay audience, and if you were going to do that, you don't do it through the journals, you do it in other means. And dramatization was their chosen method. They did also write poetry. They, some of their colleagues were involved in production of stained glass windows, referred to the frieze in the building, all ways of presenting to their ideas in a kind of more physical context. And I think in some ways the dramatic presentation of their ideas as a way to try and create some more accessible forms of communication was a way of developing what we would think of today as a public sociology, a sociology that engages with its wider public. The particular approach to dramatization that they took appears rather strange today, and in some ways quite quaint, but it's very much a product of its time. Their model for dramatization were the medieval mystery plays, the plays of the mummers who went round telling Bible stories and so on in dramatic form. And these were rather popular at the time. And Geddes and Branford were involved in the production of some huge mummery plays that tried to present, in many ways, I suppose, a history of civilization. They were trying to look at the development of ideas and knowledge as a result of social changes, and trying to present those in dramatic form. And this involved people dressing up as famous figures from history, but also dressing up as social types, taking on a role in that strict sense of the word, and appearing on stage to act out events, and there would be a commentary that would explore the implications of this. And these were actually remarkably successful at the time. They gave a number of performances in Edinburgh to audiences of many hundreds that they were oversubscribed. In London, they gave performances down just a little way down the road from the Playhouse on Cheyne Walk, where they had established a University Hall of Residence at Crosby Hall. And there again they presented these plays with members of the Sociological Society and other participants presenting and acting out these historical roles. As I say, the idea of a mystery play and this kind of almost carnivalesque performance seems rather strange today, but I think they were products of their time. They were trying to explore new ways of presenting their material, and they did start to engage with authors and playwrights who were trying to develop new forms of theatrical writing that would take up sociological ideas. Well, those ideas that they began to develop on the survey and on dramatisation, I think, did have really very little lasting influence because of all the disputes within the Sociological Society that I talked about and the way in which they were marginalised, and for various other reasons related to their particular characteristics and approach. They were marginalised and had relatively little influence. But I think there were two particular strands in the wider kind of cultural sphere that did take on some of the themes of Geddes and Branford, and that are becoming, again, to be recognised important today, and I think have moved on in ways that Geddes and Branford would have approved of and would have moved themselves if the technology available to them had been somewhat different. And these two areas that I want to now go on to look at are the development of documentary film and the development of mass observation. Documentary film techniques really, I suppose, I see it as the heir to their emphasis on dramatisation. Geddes and Branford were writing at a time when film was in its infancy. By the time film really took off in the 1920s, the main works of Geddes and Branford were really far behind them. But during the 20s and 30s, improvements in technology made it possible for people to think about using film as a method of dramatisation. And the key figures really who took this on were Humphrey Jennings and John Grierson. John Grierson was perhaps the kind of leading figure in film and documentary filming in Britain. He had a background that was very similar to that of Geddes and Branford, in that he studied with some of their associates. He particularly read philosophy in Glasgow, but he studied sociology in the USA in the 1920s. He spent a period at Chicago, where the Chicago analysis of the city shared many ideas with the work of Geddes. He knew the work of Lewis Mumford, who was really inspired by Geddes. And Grierson spent some time studying at Columbia, where he explored mass communications. Humphrey Jennings his background was rather more in the arts and crafts side of Geddes and Branford. His mother and father were architects and sculptors, and were closely associated with the Fabian Society, and a particular strand of social thought in Edwardian England, the New Age. The Edwardian New Age was a big inspiration behind these groups. And Jennings studied at the Perse School in Cambridge, which was one of the early progressive schools, where one of the teachers there, Caldwell Cook, had taken up some of the ideas on dramatisation and used them in his own English classes, and became quite an inspiring teacher. He took on the idea that children at school, by play activities, and in particular through dramatic play, could explore ideas and learn more than they could just by reading. And this really inspired Jennings to move forward in his own work and explore film dramatisation. So Grierson and Jennings were key figures in this area at the very time that the technological changes were allowing these advances to go on. They worked together at the GPO film unit and elsewhere, and it was really them, and perhaps particularly Grierson, who invented the idea of the documentary film, something we take for granted today, the kind of reality films. But they were trying to develop something that was not simply a newsreel, but was a way in which you could actually present a story, present a narrative through the use of film, by trying to allow people to express their own ideas and give voice to those. One of their earliest films was called Industrial Britain, and in that they tried to show the story of industrialisation, the declining craft skills and their transformation into a contemporary division of labour, and using the case of British industry, filming that to present a particular narrative account of industrialisation and its consequences. And they went on to look at other aspects of the economy, housing and the city. And to try and illustrate that, I'll use a couple of extracts from some of their films, just to show you the kind of techniques that they employed. They moved from initially just editing a film to present a particular story with a commentary, to films in which the workers and others that they filmed spoke for themselves. So instead of just interviewing them, you had them speak to camera and give their own story. And they went to reconstructions, a kind of an attempt to show what life was really like through a dramatic reconstruction by the participants themselves. And if I can get this working, the first film that I want to show is called Housing Problems, and it's just a short extract from this film in 1935, I think it was.
About the lights.
Okay. And in this extract, it's a woman talking about her own housing conditions.
This house, getting on my nerves. We're shored up in every room. It's a staircase that you can't walk up it unless you go into your seat. One leg is up longer than the other. And it's upstairs is coming downstairs where it's sinking. We went to see the new houses and they're lovely. But here, it gets on your nerves and everything's filthy. Dirty, filthy walls, and the vermin in the walls is wicked. So I'll tell you we're fed up. If anybody comes to see you, they say it's all bilious when they get down the stairs because it's all crooked.
And here is Mrs. Graves.
Well, we won't hear Mrs. Graves, but I just wanted to get that extract where it's clearly partially scripted, but it's an attempt to present that lady's own reflections about her housing, and the producers of the film working with her to try and present that in a dramatic way and to intercut it with pictures of the things that she's actually talking about. If I can find a way to get back to the menu, we'll look at another one. This is workers and their jobs, and in this you see the actual technique of dramatic reconstruction. We'll just look at a few minutes from the beginning of this.
Well, what is it? I'm very busy this morning.
Well, Governor, what about those fitters and turners? Nothing happened down our end yet. If we're going to get that job finished on time, we must have 6 men right away.
Well, what can we do? You know, we had hundreds of replies to that advertisement, but not one was suitable. You know, it's really very tiresome. We must get this job done in time. What can you suggest?
Well, I waited an hour at the gates this morning and couldn't get one of the crowd suitable.
No men in the district at all.
Part of the union, there's no men available. Why not try the labour exchange?
We'll get all our casual labour from there. I don't think they've any skilled men. If they have, they've probably been on the dole for years and forgotten all they knew. So, there's no harm in trying. Hello, get me the employment exchange. Hello. Johnson's, yes. Westminster, yes. What do you want in? 6 fitters and turners.
On sheet 4, your vacancies for woodcutting machinist, building trade, and billiard table work. I wish to get into the cabinet trade. Could I be split for the vacancy?
The vacancy is still open. The wage is 1.7 to 1.9 an hour. You would be suitable. Take this guy to Wilson Exchange, he will submit you to the job.
Okay, well, I think we'll stop that there. I mean, the very stilted presentation and commentary all reflecting the 1930s style of the time, but I think in many ways lots of very modern ideas there. I mean, we can see the origin of the kind of editing techniques and the way in which things were cut. And the particularly striking thing, I think, about the dramatisation, if you notice right at the beginning, was that the cast was the Poplar employment exchange. So it was again an attempt to involve people themselves, who the film was about, in the actual production of the film. So in Jennings and Grierson, you got that move towards reality filming, documentary films in ways that simply hadn't been done before, and which are now part and parcel of media production, but which we perhaps don't any longer consider very much the implications for sociology. They went on to produce some really very interesting films that took this even further, trying to integrate film techniques with poetry and music. I mean, the best example is a film by Grierson from 1937 called Night Mail, which we haven't got time to look at, but which looked at the GPO travelling post office and the work of the workers sorting the mail, and interspersed that with the poetry of W.H. Auden and the music of Benjamin Britten as a way of presenting the story of that work in a very particular context. So they were trying to develop ways of looking at ordinary events and presenting a sociological argument about them, but conveying them in a way that was accessible to a non-academic audience. Well, I'd like finally to look at the development of mass observation, which is the other methodological advance which I think owes quite a lot to the ideas of Geddes and Branford in many ways. Mass observation developed in the late 1930s. It was set up in 1937 by Humphrey Jennings, again active here, with Charles Madge. And their aim was to carry forward the documentary film ideas into actual social survey work. They wanted to involve non-professional observers in recording the everyday observations and impressions of their own lives and the lives of their families, their neighbours and their workmates. There was an attempt to get this kind of ethnography of everyday life produced by the participants themselves. Their aim in this, I think, was to try and get at authenticity. Problematic idea of what we mean by authenticity, but it was assumed that you could give some kind of authentic expression if it was the views of the participants themselves, and therefore using non-professional observers who were real participants in those situations was a way of getting the authentic voice across. One of their most famous early surveys was called 12th of May, which was a study of the coronation in 1937, when they had a number of observers in different places looking at how people treated the coronation, how they observed the crowds in the street, the behaviour of their own family, whether they were going up to London to look at the coronation, and so on. There were a number of studies that Tom Harrison, one of their associates, particularly oversaw in Bolton. In the studies by mass observation, it was called Worktown, but they were all based in Bolton, and they did surveys. One of them, the pub and the people, where they got people to go around the pubs on a pub crawl, talking to people and recording what they saw and what they did for as long as they could remember it. They did a survey of Blackpool, where they got people to write about the annual, I think it's probably holiday week rather than holiday fortnight, when everybody from Bolton went to Blackpool, and how they spent their leisure time. So a number of attempts to involve people themselves in the collecting of data and the analysis of data, and setting up a central repository where this data would flow in and could be written up in a way that was accessible to people themselves. And we're still discovering the very rich data in that, and a lot of it is now being used in dramatic reconstructions on television. You may have seen in recent years the Housewife 49 with Victoria Wood, that was based upon some of the mass observation diaries that people had sent in. In the post-war period, the work of mass observation was combined with some of the documentary film making, And Jennings produced a number of films in the 1940s. One of the most famous of these being A Diary for Timothy, which was a 1946 film in which he tried to use mass observation type data from diaries to produce a diary that looked at the educational changes, the development of the NHS through the eyes of someone born in that post-war period and about to grow up. So, to try and pull things together, I think we've got in the work of these early sociologists, amongst a lot of other things, a number of methodological innovations that say a lot about how we can present our material, how we can collect that material in a way that breaks down the boundaries between academic and lay people, and something that had its echoes in the development of the documentary film movement and in mass observation, and which I think are beginning to attract attention in other ways with the development of the increasing use of visual methods and alternative ways of presenting data, which mean, I think, that if we can go back to some of the insights of these early sociologists, we might be able to think of alternative ways of moving ourselves forward and making a greater impact, if not maximising our impact. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks so much for that, John. My name's Les Back, for those of you who don't know me, and no one asked me to say a few words in response to John's talk, and I'm mindful that many of you have probably got questions that you want to ask, so I want to keep my comments brief. But there was a number of things that struck me, and I've tried to sort of formulate this on the hoof as a series of questions that maybe help link between John's talk and this wonderful kind of hidden maverick history of sociology which you've offered us. You know, one that's global, cosmopolitan, that's multimodal, that's interested in art and science in art, that's interested in the questions of social reconstruction and change. At the kind of the very beginnings, now I wondered about a figure like Michael Young and how he might be figured in this kind of history that you've given us, as you know, generations on, but nonetheless seem to echo that. But the things that really struck me in listening to you, and what I would like to raise, is some questions that might link us to now. So to go from the beginnings of sociology to the questions of now, really, and the challenges of now. And the first one that struck me was the question of whether sociology should aim to be a resource in social reconstruction. You know, the opportunities of social reconstruction, of change, of relevance, of impact, but also perhaps the dangers of that too. Howard Becker, when he stood where you are a few months ago before Christmas, was asked, you know, should sociologists be involved in changing the world or developing manifestos for changing the world? And he said without a beat of hesitation, no, because we don't know enough. And I thought there was something interesting in that, because, you know, who amongst us who gets involved in this business of trying to figure out the world wouldn't like to see the world in a different form and shape? But perhaps, you know, the idea of social reconstruction, of impact in our time, means that we become the kind of the shadier side of Gramsci's notion of an organic intellectual, where we are really the hand servants of government, of industry, and in ways that maybe that is not necessarily an instrument of progress. Or I just wanted to put out as a question. Really. The second thing that really struck me very powerfully in your talk was their ideas about dramatisation, and I love this idea of the kind of these dramatisations as the people's university. And I was mindful some years ago when you wrote the response to Michael Burroway's Public Sociology, and said, I mean, it reminded me of that Catherine Tate figure who says, you know, am I bothered? And you said, well, is the world really bothered whether earnest and worthy sociologists want to go out there as agents of change? And she, and I've taught that essay that you wrote. I've kind of used the Catherine Tate as a figure. Well, should we presume that the world is bothered? And I wonder too, in the sort of representations that you offered and the kind of mediascapes of that time, how things like reality TV might be figured, and the carnivalesque, as you put it, of popular representations. I mean, there's Skig sitting over there who knows much more about this than me, but how quickly those sort of popular modes of speaking to reality produce a kind of, less a carnivalesque, but a kind of carnival of grotesque images that can then be judged by the viewers from a sort of superior vantage point, with the aid, of course, of a few experts who tell us whether you're a good or a bad parent, or whether you're too fat or too thin. So that's what I wondered about, what the maybe two-sidedness, if you like, of those popular forms of representation, and what that says to us about the slippery business of trying to represent reality and what reality is in a kind of multimedia and hyper-mediated context. And that the one but last question that also struck me as we were watching those fantastic passages was the degree to which all representations produce society as they kind of represent it, if you like, and how kind of comic they seem almost. I don't know if anybody else was struck this way, but on the one hand there's the grain of those voices that is incredibly powerful, but I expected Paul Whitehouse to jump out of the screen at some point and say, all right, Governor, I'm a Labour operator, I can be your Turner, I just and how what a lesson that is to perhaps in our time, in our attempts to represent the real in innovative ways, how might they be looked at in 50 years or so. So I suppose my other question was about, if we produce society as we represent it, what does that mean in terms of our understandings of what reality is and the realities we claim to represent? And then my very last thought before opening it out to everybody else was really about, I suppose, the place of sociology in the wider world and the state of the discipline itself. And I was mindful a few years ago of one of my teachers who said, who started out in anthropology, when she was studying, all anthropology students read practically every anthropology book that was published on a year-by-year basis. And given someone who's probably better placed than most, having to chair the last research assessment exercise, to have a take on the state of the discipline as well. A former colleague and friend here described, mentioned this to John before, an image of John in the lead up to the research assessment exercise, of him kind of coming out of his office every now and again and picking up huge crates of books that he would then happily carry into the office and read. And I wondered if, the kind of comparing the state of the discipline now, its range, its profusion, with those early days, what your thoughts were about the kind of priorities and values, I suppose, of sociology now. But I don't know if there's any amongst those number of questions that you wanted to respond to initially before we open out to everybody else.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, a lot of very interesting ideas there. Michael Young, I think it would be a very interesting look at. Hadn't struck me it should have done. I mean, the whole attempt of setting up the Institute of Community Studies in Bethnal Green and involving people is very much in this spirit. And I'm a little more into Michael Young's own background. I know, he at Dartington and through the Elmhurst, which he was very close. They were also close with Geddes and Branford, so there may have been an indirect link of that kind there. But that's certainly something to pursue, and I think that is an interesting example of the way in which you can try and break that down, and certainly that was what Michael Young was actually trying to do by establishing the ICS in Bethnal Green rather than in Westminster or in the Aldwych. yes, should we get engaged in social reconstruction? And I mean, Howard Becker's view, which I mean, on the face of it, seems to contradict his earlier statements on whose side are we on, where he talked about us needing to be the spokesperson for the underdogs. And I assume what he's objecting to is the kind of technocratic model of social reconstruction, which certainly Comte himself tended towards. That sociology understands processes and therefore can predict where things are going, and therefore say this is what you should do. The kind of the doctor role of the sociologist. And I think that's not the kind of role that Becker wanted, and it's not the kind of role that Geddes and Branford wanted. They were trying to see, by the involvement of people themselves in the process, they were trying to get a much more cooperative endeavour. And in fact, in their wider work, they were very much supporters of the cooperative mutual principle in all areas. Cooperative housing, cooperative production was central, and I mean their politics, as they described it in 1914, was the politics of the third way. This is their specific phrase which Branford invented, between the liberal market principle and the centralised Fabian state. And they saw the Fabians really as epitomising that technocratic model of social reconstruction, administrative socialism. And they were supporters of the cooperative principle and wanted universities to be run on that basis. And therefore, you had to involve people in that when they were producing the social survey. So I think it's a different model of social reconstruction, and it's coming up with ideas that people have contributed to themselves. So it's more akin to the model that Becker, I think, would have probably supported in terms of that. And perhaps the problem is the word reconstruction, which carries these kind of technocratic connotations. If we talk about social change or social facilitation or something, maybe that would be preferable. I think, I mean, the idea of reality TV is interesting, and what all this led to in some ways. I think it's interesting. The contemporary reality TV beginning, I think, with that program, The Family, in the family in Reading, who were filmed as what was called the Fly on the Wall documentary, simply documenting their lives. But of course that in itself was a production, a construction. It wasn't simply filming everything that happened. It was presenting a particular edited version, and they were aware of the cameras there. And you have a kind of, a very, there isn't a sharp gulf between that and the Big Brother house, and watching, where you can't actually draw any line between them. And the way in which we today talk about things like Big Brother as reality television. As you say, what is reality? Reality is something that's produced by the methods that we use to talk about it. And I think that's very clear from these. It's clear in the kind of the dramatisations that Geddes and Branford talked about. And I mean, it's probably too big a question to answer what is reality, but I think it does mean that their own account is showing that you can't simply talk about sociology as producing a kind of an external snapshot of something that pre-exists and is only out there, but that if you're going to convey something of the authentic voice of the people you're studying, they are part of it, and there is a multiplicity of voices that have to be represented. Yes, I mean the anthropologists who read every book published, I mean, it wasn't quite feasible to do that when I began in sociology, but I do remember it was quite an event when a new book was published, and the first books that I built up in my library, I could remember them all, and how much they cost, what colour the cover was, and so on. So, I mean, there has been this huge proliferation and incredible increase in the range of sociological publication, and the activity during the RAE was kind of clearly showed that the only way in which it was possible to assess the work that was going on in various places was because the funding council hired a huge warehouse in Bristol and stored everything there that all of you sent through, and then they repackaged those and sent them out in the crates that arrived in the department. And you were on like Charlie Chaplin on the production line in modern times. The crate arrived, you took it in, you worked through them, sent that off, and a new crate arrived. But I mean, what it did bring out to me in actually looking at that was the sheer range of work that's going on in sociology. I mean, I think we all have got very specialised in our own areas. That again, looking back to the time when not only Geddes and Branford were writing, but in perhaps the immediate 1950s, when sociology was expanding, people did know something about everything about what was going on. It wasn't only that the individuals knew one another. You could have a sufficient grasp of a number of different areas if you are a sociologist, but the subject has become so much more specialised, and we've become, to a certain extent, enclosed in our own specialism, that we know relatively little of what goes on beyond that. And it is a useful exercise to go through that research assessment, whatever we might think of it as recipients of the gradings. The actual process of reading all of that material was really eye-opening in terms of the range of things, because you were, I was going to say forced to read things, but I mean, that implies a kind of negative judgment. You were actually sent things that you could, you opened the parcels and read these books that you wouldn't have discovered otherwise, and the articles that appear in the journals that you wouldn't necessarily have come across, and discover first of all how different things are, but also I think how similar things are, that the same kinds of theoretical and methodological concerns in very different areas from your own interest that then lead you to actually start thinking about your own work in different ways. And I think that's something we've probably lost in sociology. It's going beyond the kind of thing I've been talking about here, but is there any way in which we can recapture something of that kind of mutual knowledge and interchange of knowledge across specialisms that doesn't seem to happen today?
Listen, I shouldn't ask any more questions, but I should open it out to anybody else. So we'd like to start. Ellie.
It's not really a question, actually, it's an observation. I think it's quite interesting. I've really enjoyed your talk. It's kind of like joined up lots of little gaps in my areas of knowledge. But I think it's interesting that we have this kind of, this little reticence about, engaging with the GPO film kind of the reality thing. When I was approached by one London gallery, and I'm working with an artist through another London gallery, who are really fascinated by the mass observation thing and the GPO film genre, which seems to be part of a kind of shift in the art world or whatever around participative, collaborative, kind of like community arts. So actually they're kind of redoing the mass observation experiment, and so it seems to me that they're kind of doing a lot of like sociological work, engaging with very sociological questions, but it's all in the space of the gallery. They're doing sociology in the gallery, whereas we seem to be a little bit kind of nervous to get into these realms. So yeah, I know an artist who's actually doing she's redoing the GPO film thing with some older people, and she's kind of worked with them doing research, and then employed artists to reenact their stories, and then the older people watch the reenactment, and then it will be played in the space where the research took place, which is an older people's care home. There's all these kind of experiments in form, which are very sociological, that are kind of like going on out there, which myself I'm very interested in getting involved in as a sociologist.
That's interesting. I must find out more about that. And I know within mass observation itself. I mean, there was a series of television programs about maybe 20 years ago, where Dan Farson, a TV presenter, actually took a study by mass observation called Exmoor Village, which was published in the 1940s, and went back to the same village and showed the film that they'd made at the time and the book to the people who had been in the film, and got them to talk about that. And so you've got a kind of intergenerational continuity and discussion. Yeah.
It's a question. I mean, this film is very interesting, John. I just wondered to whom they would have been shown, or who would have hired them to show. The reason that I wonder whether, in fact, the sort of picture you give of sociology, this branch of sociology, is quite so distinct from the sort of academic, not academic sociology, but the academic discipline. Because it seems to me a lot of the things that are going on in this tradition that you've been talking about were probably going on not in sociology as so-called in the pre-war period, but in social administration. And I speak, I don't want to go into my hobby horse, but I mean, I've been going through LSE's diaries since God knows when, and it's quite clear that sociology was a pretty marginal activity, but social administration, social science, social work and so on was a much more vibrant activity. And I think that's also true of the University of Liverpool. I remember looking at its early calendars, and basically what they were setting up was a social administration program, and they were very successful in doing it. And I would have thought this was just the sort of stuff that if you were teaching that, you'd show to social administration students at the time.
That's interesting. I think you're observing far more about it than I do. But I mean, you're right about social administration and sociology. That it was really social administration that was the big expansion, and not only Liverpool but Birmingham and I think Manchester and so on, where it was going under the label perhaps social science, but it was actually social administration and organisations like the Charity Organisation Society being involved there. The films that were produced, though, I think were actually surprisingly in some ways kind of semi-commercial productions for an industrial audience. I mean, the GPO film unit was the GPO, and these were little shorts that were sent out as kind of publicity material. And Grierson in particular had lots of struggles with his superiors about the cost of these films, and to keep in budget, and kind of what was the purpose. But I mean, there were a number of organisations that they worked for on a kind of contract basis. So I think the Colonial Sugar Corporation or something, and I mean they did some work for Shell and Unilever. It was linked with the Ministry of Information or the Office of Information, and so there was something of a kind of government propaganda aspect to it. And I think these were all the kind of films that would appear as sometimes shorts in the cinema, but also would be sent out for use in schools and so on. I remember, I mean, even in the early 1970s, when I was doing some part-time teaching at a remand centre, we had deliveries of films that came through the agencies produced by companies, and they were very much these kind of films, and I don't think not so good in some ways, I mean. But they were these kind of things that were produced simply to publicise something, about the history of money or something, and they were used in educational contexts. So I mean, it's interesting that this kind of thing was done in a kind of contract relationship for commercial purposes, and again, something that we perhaps think that would be kind of selling yourself down the river to be involved in, but they were trying to use it for a broader purpose.
That leads on to what I wanted to ask about the kind of the moral tone of early sociology, because with the and the period that as it moves through to the 1930s and the Great Depression and what's happening, it's almost as if that's absent.
Yeah.
So if you think of a labour exchange in the 1930s, I'm sure it wasn't anything like that.
No.
You know, big queues down the road, whatever.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, did they have, because they weren't the evolutionists, did they have a very strong moral idea of changing the people as opposed to changing social conditions? Because I know there's the kind of the social realism around housing conditions, but then we've also got the tradition in social realism of changing the people. And I'm just wondering if the early sociology, which I know nothing about, was more concerned with changing the people and that type of reconstruction rather than changing housing. Because they're not really addressing things like unemployment, which were massive, you know, in that period, or eating, surviving, living. So type of improving or moral tone, or something like that, I think I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly did want to. I can say they did want to change people, but I mean they had an interest in changing the people rather than simply the conditions, but saw the conditions as productive of the people. So although they weren't evolutionists in the sense of Spencer or Hobhouse, they were very clearly evolutionists in the idea that people adapted to their environment, were a product of their environment, and I mean certainly Geddes wrote books on the biology of evolution and so on. So that was a key area, and so they saw the adaptive principle as important and argued actually against the eugenic position very strongly. I think that's one of the big conflicts in the society, that people weren't born with fixed characteristics, but were born in a flexible way, and take people from one environment, put them in another, and they will develop in different directions. And again, I mean, they were, in terms of the moral tone of what they said and their politics, that they were products of their time, and shared many of the kind of conventional assumptions. But they were, in some respect, quite radical. I mean, if you look at their views on women and gender, for example, they seem, very conservative by today sociological standards. But in terms of our image of what sociologists said about women and gender, they were actually quite progressive in terms of seeing the distinctive characteristics of masculinity and femininity as a result of the differential environment and their involvement in work conditions and so on. So that there was that kind of openness and recognition of change, and I think that was again perhaps why they wanted to see people themselves as the active agents in that change, because it wasn't a matter of just scientifically determining the direction in which that change should go, that people had to be a part of it.
Just a bit more to film.
Get back to the interesting bit.
I wonder if I could just take another small liberty and just picking up on Ali's point, because I think one of the things that came through your talking in the chapter as well that we can read, and we'll circulate the link to it, is this kind of incredible energy and drive to engage, and enact sort of dialogues of different kinds, of all kinds of surprising, I suppose, from our sort of stereotypes of what it must have been like then, and also that sort of drive towards a kind of democratising of observation in some way, and I think Ali's absolutely right that there's something very exciting about art practitioners who have some of that drive to enact new kinds of forms of dialogue and to represent and make things, actually, which I find really inspiring, like you do. And I just wondered if that was one of the things that that you'd thought about in terms of, you mentioned voice several times, and who speaks, who observes, who's the observer?
Yeah. I think they developed their ideas probably in a rather unreflective way, and I think didn't look at it in the way that we might now describe it. I mean, it was, I think, for all of them, the cooperative movement was extremely important as their basis, and I think therefore it seemed natural that those cooperative mutual principles should be applied in social research and in the university, and it was really, I think, in that way that just as it seemed obvious and natural that the producers should be the owners of their own process of production, so the producers of social change should actually own the process in that sense. So it was a political project, but they didn't reflect theoretically on the rationale for that. I think it was a taken for granted political project. But they certainly had this, as I think you put it, kind of drive to engage. But I think it was actually quite limited by their own lack of political skills, and in some sense the kind of political naivety that they had. They tended to assume that if you had a good idea and told people about it, then people would accept it. People would recognise that. Oh yes, you're right. That's what we should do. They didn't have a conception of how you go about organising and representing that interest, and so they again were rather marginalised in a lot of the political arguments of the 20s and the 30s. So although they were advocating this third way or something to be developed, it was really others who took forward third way ideas, and often in a very different direction. You have people as diverse as Oswald Mosley and Harold Macmillan talking about a middle way, a third way, and a new party, and so on. And certainly, I mean, some people like Mosley were rather better at political organisation in some respects than Geddes and Branford. They had a view that education was important, and certainly they saw this as a way in which education was a force that could change people, and education was something in which you had to have an active engagement yourself. So they wanted, they very much supported the progressive movement in schooling, where again you tried to break down the boundaries between academic education and practical life. So it was important that children at school learnt physical material skills, and I mean they saw in particular scouting was important, woodcraft skills, and the organisation of they tied this to a very particular psychological theory of development. They had to develop through the learning of particular skills, moving through various stages of development. But they did think of education as something that had to be a process of continual development, and that went on into adult life, which is why, again, that they had various strategies for reconstructing the university and establishing a global university. They took up some of the ideas of Charles Ferguson in the USA on the university militant. That just as the church militant had been the force in the medieval period, the university had to be the key social force in the contemporary period, in the culmination of the educational system and bringing in the community to the university, and they saw the importance of universities becoming internationalized, that they had to have an important regional base but also had to have this international context, and wanted to establish an international university. And I suppose it's interesting being in the Richard Hogarth building. One of the things that they were interested in and were very involved in was the early formation of UNESCO, and its kind of global educational purpose. But again, they had a slight kind of naivety about this. I mean, well, more than slight. But they wanted, for example, an international university, and proposed that this was Victor Branford's brother who particularly proposed this, that it should be established in Cyprus as somewhere that was a particular base for this, that it was a kind of a central focus. But it would bring together scholars from all countries and would be self-sustaining through kind of cooperative agriculture, and that within Cyprus that would fund it. And so, I mean, again, there was the cooperative principle was important, but it was seen in a rather naive and unreflective way. But the ultimate goal seems, very radical. This idea of a global international university in which the cosmopolitan scholars would come together. Sorry, I strayed around a bit.
No.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I don't know a great deal about British sociology, but I just had a couple of questions. One, I suppose, about the implications of recovering this tradition to the way sociology is taught. Because in a sense, what you're talking about in mass observation, that sort of thing, is producing knowledge through, in a sense, a process where sociologists do more than just observe the world. In some ways, they produce experiences where other people are, in fact, the subjects of those experiences. And of course, that's always very unpredictable, and a whole lot of things come out of it, I think. But it seems, and of course, that's why artistic practice, I think people are very interested in at the moment, because of its openness and because of its materiality, if you like, and embodiment. Dimensions, if I might say, aren't very strong in the way we teach sociology, where in a sense we ask people to read and write essays. Now, I know if I was, for example, going to see a brain surgeon, I'd hope their professional training went beyond reading and writing essays. And just really wondering about your views about that in terms of recovering this tradition, what it might have in terms of the way we teach sociology, what we communicate to students constitutes sociological practice. And the second thing, I suppose, is really the fact that this is very much, from what you've described, a collective effort of research, which is perhaps stronger in other, I think, European countries. But I've always had the impression in Britain, I come from Australia, it's probably obvious, and their sociology is really the product of displaced historians and political scientists who have a mode of practice which is very individual and almost archival in a way, and very little sense of building programs, building teams of researchers, and that sort of thing. With the natural sciences are obviously much stronger at, and perhaps much more creative in some ways because of. So I suppose my second point really is, does this tradition recovering it have any implications for the way we think about, I suppose, collective production of knowledge in sociology? And I suppose that raises a whole lot of problems as well, what we're going to get RAE'd on and all that kind of stuff. But I suppose my more general sense is implications for teaching on one hand, and the way we as researchers on the other hand do work today.
Right. Yes, I mean that is interesting, and I mean in terms of the second point first, I mean about collective effort and teams. I think that it is something I have to think more about that. But I think it's clear. I mean, that they were proposing kind of the idea that social research had to be a collective effort. That was clearly very much their view, and therefore the individual scholar was the coordinator or the impresario of these diverse efforts. And of course the team wasn't necessarily just other academics, but as I said, people outside. And so that does imply a particular model of social research, and it's actually difficult to see how you could easily establish that on a regular basis in the universities today. In terms of teaching, again, that's something that's well worth pursuing, because certainly the essays that we get our students to write are mini versions of the articles that we have to write for the journals. And the case of the brain surgeon is very instructive. I think that should we be getting students to do things that are more practically related to the kind of things that they'll be using their sociology for, whatever that might be. But I think we can think in terms of what would be the prospects for using methods of film and audio production, for example, in classes, and a number of people are exploring that as a way of students producing a portfolio of works of that kind, rather than simply relying on the essay, and that would be one direction in which we could perhaps pursue that. But I mean, it's very difficult. The ways in which the universities are set up today makes it quite difficult to do that, because work has to be available for the external examiner to see, and if you're having a kind of performance work, how do you ensure that that's available? But you've raised a couple of interesting questions. Certainly, I mean, the question about teaching is something that I don't think that these writers looked at all, but it is something that the logic of what they're doing implies an extension to that.
Can I ask a quick question before we give you the wine? Two questions. It's really exciting that they, as you said, gave physical expression to the surveys through the stained glass and the sculptures. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. But linking in with Alison's questions on participative methods and the use of that, especially now in galleries and artists. On the one hand, that's very good, but it's also linked to funding, to Arts Council funding, where there has to be a checklist of, you've consulted every so-called group in the world, the local estate, the refugee and so forth, so it becomes a hit list. And I wondered if, in the current discussion that's developing with universities and measurable ways of gauging social impact, we may also fall into that quite problematic, I think, Arts Council model, where the words are used of participation and it is engaged with, but there's quite a lot of, I don't know what you would call symbolic violence in that engagement, and it's incredibly unequal, which sounds very different from what Geddes and what you've been giving us from the early British sociology, even though they were unreflexive.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting that their relationship to these kind of movements in arts, and it was something that began very early on. That I mean, Geddes in Edinburgh was associated with the development of renewed interest in Celtic art in the 1880s, 1890s, and was very active in setting up the Edinburgh School of Art and development there. They were both inspired by Ruskin and were very embedded in the kind of the Ruskin movement, and the whole William Morris and the arts and crafts that came out of that, and worked closely with a lot of people like the architect Ashby, who set up the workshops in Chipping Campden and elsewhere, was one of the architects who was involved with them in the development of Crosby Hall, as a university residence. And actually, next door to Crosby Hall is a block of apartments called Moore's Gardens on the corner of Cheney Street and Beaufort Street. And in there's a design by Ashby, which is another one of these wall friezes, and you can, the doors are locked, but you can go and peer in and you can actually see this inside. They worked with designers like Eric Gill, who was involved, and one of his students was a Belgian writer called Philippe Maret, who was the biographer of Geddes, but was also an expert in stained glass construction and produced the images for them. And they didn't see the kind of barrier between that and their other activities. So Maret, like Geddes, was active in the psychoanalytic movement and wrote about development of Adler's work. They were very active there. So it is a different kind of model of what you're saying in terms of the contemporary relationship to Arts Council and others. And I think it's a different kind of model from the way in which we've been encouraged to think about impact in terms of, in quotes, users. That you have to have your users that you consult, and so you've got your kind of hit list of all this. Where and what that implies is either the kind of technocratic model of social change, or the kind of customer-contractor model that you're in a service relationship. And again, they wanted a third way between the two, where it was a partnership, and in which each side actually engaged with the other. So again, it's back to some of the things I said about public sociology. It's not just who will speak, but who will listen. And both sides have to listen. There has to be that kind of conversation or dialogue, and that's why Geddes and Branford produced some rather bad poetry and literature, because they were trying to engage in that, but they did work with others who had greater skills. So I think the justification was very much in Comte's model of society, where Comte saw what he called the intellectuals and the emotionals as being the two key cultural forces, and having to bring those together. And the sociologists were the in his sexist language, the philosopher kings, the key intellectuals, but those involved in literature, drama, poetry were the emotionals, and had an equal role to contribute. And you couldn't have a social reconstruction that was purely driven by the intellectuals. It had to include the emotionals, so it's two working together. And so it's how one can try and carry forward that aspiration in a world that is predominantly technocratic and customer oriented, in a very different model.
Yeah. Anybody else got any more final questions before we offer you a very well deserved drink? Any final questions? Now's the time to ask. Well, we should thank you massively.
Well, thank you.
And I think I'm right in saying, Nirmal, that there'll be some refreshments just outside. So please, outside the bookshop.
But I think the interest came about almost by accident. but I was aware of the name, particularly of Victor Branford, something that I'd come across mainly in footnotes of articles, but no one had actually written about him, and it's a name that somehow registered, and I was very influenced by an argument of Perry Anderson that said there'd be no classical sociology in Britain, and so I was wondering about the discrepancy between these two, that this name kept appearing, but nobody seemed to know what he said. And I was giving a talk at London School of Economics on their centenary conference, and someone in the audience asked a question, why is there nothing about Victor Branford? And this turned out to be Victor Branford's granddaughter, who was very interested there. And so that meant after that I actually went away and thought, well, I must find out something about this. And so worked with Chris Husbands at the LSE and began to dig into this, and found there was a very widespread sociological movement around Branford and Geddes and others, that it was important to rediscover that. A lot of the things that they talked about were really pioneering ideas at the time, and then things moved on and no one took them up, and we're now saying sociology must be more global, sociology must be concerned with the environment, and sociology ought to have these different kinds of methods. And these were precisely the things that they were arguing about, and so I think people are starting to become aware of all these issues. And if we go back and look at what they said, we can really learn a lot from that, and we don't have to start reinventing everything from scratch. We've got the basic ideas there that we can then build on. There's a lot of pressure on sociologists to engage with users, to demonstrate the impact of their research. And if we want to explore these new ways of presenting our data, which are quite expensive ways of doing it, then maybe collaboration with industry would be a way forward. I think a lot of us have perhaps typically been rather sceptical about that and don't want to appear to be doing things at the behest of industry. But I think if you can maintain your own autonomy about that and do something that's mutually beneficial, then the funding comes in and we get our message across. And I think that there will be a genuine interest amongst industry and also the third sector organisations in this kind of material.